Welcome back to the fourth video in this Yamaha 4-stroke outboard engine series. A stumble heard at all RPM ranges brought us to the carburetors through troubleshooting, which we removed from the engine in part 1. Part 2 involved disassembly of the components, where we also found a broken piece of a carb. Carburetor 4 was disassembled, inspected, cleaned, and reassembled in great detail. It was decided the old floats would be reused. Once Carb 4 was closed up, it was inspected, and we moved on to Chapter 3. We kicked things off with the repair of the brass fitting on carburetor number 3. This also introduced the project to the cold start valves that were disassembled and cleaned, tested for resistance as well as current draw, and finally functionality before the device was reassembled with new seals. Once all carbs were finished, we found that 2 jets needed to be swapped, so jets from 1 and 3 were swapped. We moved on to the accelerator pump hose issue requiring complete disassembly. We found it also needed to be cleaned, so just as well. There was a small reducer that needed to be put into the new hose, and the new hose was installed, the accelerator pump reassembled, and it brings us now to Chapter 4. I wanted to start cleaning up metal brackets like this so we get a good seal. You can see there's a lot of residue. Just mixing some window cleaner and metal polish to get that grime off. Spraying it on the paper towel as well as on the metal part, and we're just going to go through real quick, and it's getting all that grime and oil and dirt that's been built up on there nice and clean, so we get a good seal. Moving on. This bracket right here, I'm just going to clean this up with a cotton towel and some cleaner, nothing else. But if we look on the other side, we'll see that I kept the O-rings in, and there's a lot of debris that's on the surface of this plastic that's just built up over time. The O-rings we're going to replace are 93210-35 Mike 86. So first thing I'm going to do is pull out these O-rings, put them off to the side, and get a close-up of the grime and the oil that's accumulated on this part that we want to clean first. So I'm going to spray with some cleaner, and then I'm going to hit it with that towel, the cotton towel, and it's all coming off. Just takes a couple of cycles of cleaning. This part's now cleaned up and ready for new O-rings. So I'll just drop them in one at a time. The seat is kind of shallow on this, so it takes a little bit of work. This part's ready, I'll put it off to the side. We're going to replace the O-rings on the air silencer now. And this is part 93210-38 Mike Hotel 3. I'll start by extracting the old rings. And having cleaned behind these recesses, I will now install the new ones. This part is now done. I'll put it off to the side. Spraying cleaner on the bolts and washers. I'm going to let them soak for a while. Rinse them and dry them. Here was the hose I cut to remove that piece of the carburetor that broke. It is part number 62 Yankee-24312-00. Having tested this, I want to make a slight modification right here with a file, because there is very little clearance on the sharp edge for a cable tie, which weakens the cable tie here. So I'm going to take the file and just round this little piece to provide just like a 0.5 millimeter of clearance so the cable tie fits smoothly under there. Because as you tighten it, it shaves it to a degree. With the hose installed now, we see that extra bit of clearance for the cable tie, which we can now slide right in without cutting it or shaving it down. It's much easier to work with too, because there's no resistance for that cable tie. We could tighten it now into place to secure the hose. Trying it earlier, you couldn't rotate this cable tie back and forth, and if you could move it a little black flakes would come off as it grinded down. Clip the end and we're done. This piece is now ready. The other carb has the same hose and the end looks a bit frayed. It looks like the cable tie didn't sit correctly on this one, and we're going to replace this hose because I happen to have the second one came with the kit. It was a pair, so I'm doing the same exact job as before and replacing that hose. Carbs 1 and 3 have this hose on the bottom that connects to the bottom of the bowl. This is carb 3. I connect that hose now, run a cable tie under it, and we're going to make sure the cable tie is straight before we tighten it down. It's not crimping the end of the hose like we saw previously. and then we'll just clip that end off. And then I'll repeat this task for carb number 1. We'll be replacing these larger O-rings on the carbs now. Part number 93210-30 Mike Hotel 4. And I'm going to simply pop them out one by one. And after cleaning behind the recesses, the new ones will be installed back into position. Moving on to the other side, things get problematic. This is purported to be part number 93210-35 Mike 86. I'm going to remove one O-ring, having already done this before. Noticing how incredibly shallow this area is, I'm going to take this O-ring and install it now in position. And we'll see immediately that the O-ring is too small to sit properly in here. There's simply no way to get it in to sit reliably for the reassembly of these carbs back into the larger system. We can see it just pops right out. And we're going to see later why these O-rings are expected at a minimum to at least be able to sit in place. That'll become obvious. So I double-checked my work, and this was identified as part 17. And part 17 right here in 93210-35M86, and our part 93210-35M86. For testing purposes, I tried stretching out an O-ring to see if it would seat properly, and for a short amount of time it does, but then it slowly starts constricting again and falling off the carb. And even when it does, when it's stretched out, it becomes too thin to actually be crimped down. So when I discover the mystery here, I'm going to put it in the comments below. But for now, we're going to clean up the old O-rings, which appear to be correct and different, and we're going to reinstall these O-rings back into the system. These are the input sides of the carb, so I'm less concerned, but I feel more comfortable with the old O-rings than the new ones, and that tells you something. So I'm going to remove these O-rings with great care. There are times that you're going to reuse O-rings, so I guess it's good to show this at least once in the video. So I spray them with cleaner on both sides and let them soak for a bit, and then rub them between my fingers as I turn them to remove any dirt that's on them, taking care not to stretch them in any way. And I'm rubbing them on the paper towel that light friction will remove any of that dirt. Again, being sure not to stretch them because they're old O-rings and they'll break. And I've washed them under warm water and I'll let them dry. Any O-ring dressing is fine. I use Jack's 327 for my pool, and I'm just putting the lightest silhouette of it between my fingers and just glazing it very lightly, just so you see a light shine on the O-ring, and I'm going to do it to all 4 of them. Make sure you put the O-ring down on something clean after applying this kind of stuff, because dirt and hair and whatnot will stick to it after this is applied. And now the O-rings are reinstalled, matching up the detents of the O-rings into their original positions. It's a little sticky, but eventually they go in. Again, I would have liked new O-rings, but these new ones did not fit properly, and it turned out that these were just fine, in good condition. Cleaned up, there'll be no issues, so I'm happy with this. Placing these 8 washers back into the silencer box now. They could be put in with the bolts, but I'm just putting them in separately. And with the orientation of the air silencer with the breather port on the left, along with this bracket, accelerator pump mounts on the right sitting like this. I check that all 4 O-rings are still fully seated, and push this bracket up against the O-rings mounted onto the air silencer box like so. Then I push the bolts through, starting on the corners, and you don't need to push it through all of them, though I choose to do so. Looking from the other side, we can see what this looks like. We could also check to see if any of these O-rings had fallen out by just pulling it away a little bit and having a look, but these are all fully seated, so I push them back and we move on. I know it will be easier to connect the hose for the fuel line for carbs 1 and 2 together before installation, so I'm going to do that now. And I'm going to connect this hose just because we're already connecting that first one and install these as a pair. My hand is blocking, but we'll get a good view in a moment. The 4 bolts on the left side are running through the carbs, transversing all the way through to the other side, effectively mounting it, as we can now see. I'm just pushing the bolts up all the way through that the carb seats up all the way against that metal bracket. I'm using an M6 nut to temporarily fasten everything together. I'm not making it tight, it's just going to be finger tight to draw out the slack and nothing more. Both carbs are obviously going to be tightened down. Once the top is done, I'll put nuts on the bottom bolts as well. You see a raised metal portion of the bracket centers the carb. There's a detent in the carb, and we push it all the way in, and then we tighten the bolt, and we know the carb is in the exact location it's supposed to be. I do the third one now. This is easier because it stands alone, so it wasn't binding from the hose connected to the other carb, so I just push the bolts right through, and then I secure it with a nut. The fourth and final carb now goes in the exact same manner. And we conduct a preliminary inspection. One of the reasons carb 1 and 2 were binding was this cable tie right here. There's very little clearance in between, so they need to be checked to make sure that there's no binding. This cable is supposed to be impinged under this bracket, so I'll loosen those 2 nuts. And that way I can install the cable under the bracket, and then those 2 nuts will be retightened. I now have the final bracket for this assembly in position. We can see which way the carbs are sitting, and we can see which way this is sitting, and it's just going to flip upward like this, sitting on the carbs like that. Carefully holding each carb as well as the bolt on the back, I'm removing these nuts one at a time. The carbs do shift a little, especially numbers 1 and 2, with the hose holding them together. Very carefully placing this bracket over, I'm going to start in the corners, turning the bolt, you can see on the top right, just get a couple turns to hold it in position, and then the top left, turning the bolt a couple times. And then I'm going to work on this carb, which you can see the hoses have shifted it, so I'm going to make sure it's aligned in those aligning pins, and then this carb a couple of turns to get that one into position. And then I'm going to twist them all, making sure, and I'm looking to make sure the carbs are seating properly into the bracket on the other side. I'm showing a bolt being turned in an upright position for the camera angle only, but this is not really a good idea to do. So I'm just going to show from a different angle on the table, me turning in the bolts as I've already flipped the unit over to turn these bottom ones in now. Using my extension and the 10mm socket, all I'm doing is drawing out the slack, nothing more. So I really don't care what order I'm doing it, I just want the slack on, making sure that everything is seated in those centering pins. Now I'm checking the seatings of the O-rings closest to me in each carb with a flashlight. If I don't see them, then they're seated properly. If I see one smushed through, obviously I messed up. As I don't see anything, the O-ring set properly, didn't fall out during installation. Now I'm opening each throttle and looking through to the other side where the O-ring furthest from me on the carb would be, making sure I don't see an O-ring that might have fallen through during installation. And this one looks good, and I'll move on and look at all 4 of them. Should there be an issue, I'll have to take it apart and fix it. Now I'm tightening the bolts, starting from a cross pattern from the middle first using the 10mm, and I'm snugging them down so that the washer, the spring washer, is fully compressed, but I'm not using too much torque, remembering that the silencer box is plastic and I don't want to break it. The manual doesn't specify a specific torque for this, so I'm using those washers as my guide. Reattaching some hoses now, which have been kept separate from these carburetors until this point in installation. Adding that cable tie and just snugging it down, clipping it off, moving on to the next one, which is over here on the other side. Same procedure. And then this fuel line right here, putting a cable tie on this one. Going to add the other fuel lines back on the carb, starting with this one with the white T-fitting. Not only do I have pictures of how it was taken off to put it back on, but I'm also using the reference diagram from the manual in case it was put on improperly the last time. Now we have the cable with the black T-fitting, presenting a bit more of a challenge. Not the hose at the bottom, but the hose at the top. You see it has to curl under around to get into that fitting. Push the bottom one on first because it's easy. You can see this top one, I have to negotiate under and then push up with my finger as I push forward to guide it to the fitting. And then if I use some forward force, it'll eventually seat properly. Then I'll just put a cable tie on each of them. Notice how the hose sits right in this divot in the metal bracket over here. Now I'll go through a final inspection of all these hoses, make sure they all have cable ties on them, that I haven't forgotten any, so we can then move on to our next portion of the project. I'm going to remove these two screws here, placed in earlier for the mounting of the accelerator pump. I'd previously reconnected this bottom hose for fitment. I'm now disconnecting it because the accelerator pump will be installed with that hose pushed through like so, lining up these two areas where the screws will go through. I'll now place the screws in so that I can mount this accelerator pump onto the main unit, just loosely screwing it in for now until both are loosely fit, and then I'll just snug them both down. We can see how this cable wraps around the back of this plastic manifold and then reconnects back into the accelerator pump like so. I noticed there was a third screw that was missing. I had not removed this in earlier videos, so we're going to have to order this one. Also, when I removed the accelerator pump earlier, I didn't have to disconnect this hose. You could see it was scrunched, installed improperly, and that's why it was broken. I'm running the hose for the fourth carb first in accordance with the manual, running just over the second manifold here and under and through the accelerator pump under this bolt. And we can see right here an area that holds the cable in a bend. I'm going to plug it into the fitting on the carb first and then push it into this molding on the carb. From the back side, I'll take that hose and plug it into the top available slot on the accelerator pump, completing the first one. At this point, I could connect the linkage from the accelerator pump to the throttle. Light force snapped it right in. We give it a little push. We see everything is working fine. I try to round out the end of the hose for carb 3 before pushing it through this hole in the bracket. Took a little effort to get it started, but once it got started, I was able to pull it straight through, just taking enough hose to work with to make my way down to the small fitting on the carburetor. So there it goes. The other end, I go and move out of the way for now. Make my connection onto the carb. And then push it into that fitting on the carb to hold it in place. It looks good, so I flip that cable up and over the next manifold, pulling it around back. And I plug it into the next available port. Everything looks good so far. 2 down. 2 to go. Rolling the end of the hose for carb 2 to fit through the bracket now. I push it in. More room to work on this one, so it's a bit easier. Taking enough slack again to put it into the fitting on the carb and then dress it into that small bracket. This one will flip over the top pipe of the manifold, around it and back forward, in front of this pipe and around back again. It should all look just like this. And this should plug into the next available fitting, like so. Though I'll tell you, I think this is the wrong hose, a little too short, so I have swapped this with the second fitting to give it more slack, because I don't want it pulled too taut. So now everything's good. The hose for carb 1, I'll be starting at the accelerator pump, wrapping around and going right into the bracket like so. Not going through any of the manifold pipes, I plug directly into the fitting on the carb. There are no metal holders cast in the carb number 1, and a breather hose will run under here during installation back into the motor. I dress this off with a hose clamp, and this portion is now completed. Finally, we'll reinstall this throttle linkage to connect all 4 carbs back together. The rounded portion will be on carb number 4 on the bottom, snapping them in one at a time. There's 3, and then 2, and the squared one, carb number 1. Now they're all worked together linked. They're not balanced. The screws may have shifted a little, though I tried not to shift the screws while I was working on them. And that concludes Chapter 4 in this series, the carburetor cleaning and rebuild. Chapter 5 will be installing it, setting it up, and testing it out. I hope you found this video enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Do me a favor, hit that like button down below. Helps me out a lot when you do. And hit that subscribe button for more videos like this when they come out. When the next video in the series comes out, a link will be posted in the top right corner. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?